I learned this even when I worked at the patent office. The patent office literally has, across the street from where I worked, there's several buildings, 5 of them for the patent office. And I was prohibited from visiting, which I used to do all the time, the energy and security area of the patent office that has a vault. And the vault basically is just a guarded room that's locked. And it turns out there's at least 4,000 patents that are secretized. That's the
The
word that
Invention
the patent
Secrecy
office.
Act.
Right.
Okay.
However, that doesn't cover the reason that they're secretized, because the Invention Secrecy Act really addresses atomic energy and various other things that are dangerous. But energy
Okay.
and propulsion normally are not dangerous, except if they're very powerful. And that
Hmm.
becomes the gray area where these get previewed. And I used to get a sheet of paper, which I still have copies of, that had every single military agency with a little box next to their acronym signing off on a particular application of whether or not it should be secretized. And I would only get it if they said no. And if they said yes, it would go across the street and never be seen again.
My guest today is Dr. Thomas Valone. He's an engineering physicist with over 25 years of experience in emerging energy sciences. He's also a consulting fellow of the World Innovation Foundation and has several books as well as over 100 articles in print. He's received a PhD in general engineering from Kennedy Western University and also a master's in physics from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Valone is also the founder of the Integrity Research Institute. If you go to their website, the mission statement for the Integrity Research Institute, which was founded in 1991, is the goal of helping to educate the public on all the new emerging and eco-friendly technologies that can help to renew our Earth as well as its inhabitants, including energy generation for power and propulsion, as well as bioelectronics and optimal health and well-being. Valone has appeared on many programs, including History Channel's Ancient Aliens, and anyone who's studied UFOs or the connections between electricity and gravity is surely aware of his work. For me, it was really a pleasure to be able to sit down with Dr. Valone and learn more about his storied career. So join me as we dive down the rabbit hole, covering everything from climate to medicine and UFOs. Let's get started. Wanted to start out just by asking you about your background and particularly the Integrity Research Institute. How did you found that and why did you decide to do that?
Actually, the simple answer is that I started with an integrity electronics company back in the 1970s, 80s in Buffalo, New York. And I found that working for profit was really a difficult process. And it became Integrity Research Corporation. And also, I lost my shirt when the Mideast War started in 1990. And literally, the phone stopped ringing. So we had different instrumentation that was actually very valuable for measuring power line magnetic fields and so forth. So I had a very unique product line, but unfortunately, as I say, for profit it turned out to be a lesson that I learned. So going through a divorce and bankruptcy and all that, I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, started volunteering and working to really visit very nonprofit offices, in other words, in the downtown area. And I found the personal attraction to doing philosophically, ethically valid activity with perhaps a monetary gain that's secondary is what nonprofits do. NGOs are famous for that. Public education, public service first. Money is sort of part of that process, but the nonprofit allows for the service to be primary. And the IRS lets tax deductions happen with that. So I formed literally in 1990 Integrity Institute, and then 10 years later, when I met my wife, we reincorporated so that we have only 3 board members, and we have tight control over the nonprofit Integrity Research Institute. And ever since then...
What would you say is the goal of the Institute?
Oh, sure. The goals and missions, the mission statement, literally, which is filed for the IRS, is that we're dedicated to scientific research in the scientific integrity, research of scientific integrity in the areas of energy, propulsion, and bioenergetics. And those three areas are very challenging. If we want to save humanity, the clean energy, clean propulsion, new types of propulsion without just exhaust coming out the back of the rocket, and of course bioenergetics instead of pharmaceutical monthly bills for drugs that have side effects. That's essentially the three mission statement.
And I think that breaks down well in terms of the questions that I was looking at, wanting to discuss with you, sort of three categories in regards to the climate, healing, and finally electrogravitics and energy.
Okay.
So perhaps we could just start with some of those climate topics, and then we could kind of progress from there. Yeah, go ahead.
The climate story is something I've concentrated on quite a bit, and there's at least a dozen journal articles online. I could probably pull one up to share screen with it as well. But the latest news, which you might be able to see if I show this on the screen,
Earth warms as heat trapping doubles.
And the doubling to me was a surprise, because as a matter of course, we've been looking at parts per million of CO2, which has an upward curve that everyone is familiar with, 290 parts per million back in the 50s, even up to 1970 or so, and then basically we've had this exponential increase up to 420 parts per million today. Now we're exceeding the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere that the Earth has ever seen for 400,000 years. In fact, we even have a graph I can show that proves that. It goes through 4 ice ages, and still it never exceeds 290. So now we're pushing that up 40% higher and thinking, oh, no big deal. Well, it's huge, and this article proves it, because when you have heat trapping since 1993, in other words, in 30 years, and only 30 years, the wattage per square meter has gone from a half a watt to 0.9 something, depending on which source you're looking at, watts per meter. So it literally doubled in 30 years, which means if now I go ahead and graph and look at the graph from the last century to this, we're actually looking at another exponential increase that maps the parts per million. And that's because CO2 is a heat-trapping gas. So climate is on a runaway curve that all the newspapers and the media and the social media has not notified the public as the seriousness and the urgency that really it should attract. And then we have at least one political candidate and many others that are trying to deny the seriousness of climate change and support fossil fuels. And of course that's what we have with IPCC and so forth. We have a big oil influence. Here's another article I just pulled up from the internet. And this is really a sad corruption of the International Panel on Climate Change. How can you have, and I was shocked when I first learned this about a year ago, that IPCC is now corrupted when they issue the summary, because the oil companies have an influence into the wording that the public will see. And 90% of the public, 80 to 90%, it's said, only read the summary of this huge report they give out every few years. So that's a brief overview of how serious it is, and then I can talk about solutions. And the solutions which I published is grabbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequestering it into carbonate, many other products that can be made from CO2. But the important thing is, even with Climeworks and a few other companies that are doing millions of tons, megatons in other words, of CO2 per year, we need to do 1,000 times more. And if we just get to 1 gigaton per year, that's a good start. In fact, even IPCC, you see a little report that says, oh, by 2030 or 2050, we might be looking at 10 gigatons. Well, guess what? We're putting 40 gigatons into the atmosphere every year of CO2, and it stays there. I've seen one scientist say, the CO2 from Model T Fords is still up in the atmosphere. And that's how serious the CO2 problem is. It's a garbage dump that keeps growing. And it doesn't go anywhere because the oceans are already saturated. So grabbing the 40 gigatons out of the atmosphere is even what IPCC surprisingly advocates, because they don't want to get rid of fossil fuels. They think, well, if you get rid of the CO2, we're solving the problem. Taking out the garbage each year. But up to 40 is the challenge that requires, at the best financial investment we can possibly find, $25, say, per ton, which I think can get down to maybe $1 per ton if we do solar and wind renewable energy powered. We're still looking at almost $1 trillion per gigaton, which is obviously prohibitive. So we have a challenge that no one's acknowledging, a big elephant in the china shop, and unless we do it soon, like we're seeing, every 30 years or less, we're going to keep doubling the wattage that we're retaining of heat and experiencing worse and worse summers. I mean, there's no limit to 120 degrees, 130 degrees, Death Valley's up to 130 already. So we have to be aware of the seriousness of the frogs in a boiling pot that's slowly getting warmer and warmer. And we're not acknowledging how warm it can get. Because we're turning into a Venus hothouse. So that's how serious it is.
Right. So you mentioned carbon capture. From what I understand about carbon capture, it's not as efficient as it could be. It's sort of prohibitive in the sense that the amount of energy required to achieve, real levels of carbon capture is prohibitive. Is that a correct understanding? Are there any technologies that might be emerging that would enable us to increase that efficiency, decrease the cost of that process?
Yes. In fact, just one example is olivine. Olivine is actually a very natural rock that appears in various places throughout the world. There's an olivine NGO that sent me one of the rocks, one of the olivine rocks. It's kind of a green-colored rock. And it's fascinating that when it's ground up into powder, it tends to be a very good sponge for CO2. And this is the kind of natural attractant that we would want to essentially grab CO2 cheaply and inexpensively so that we can finally start pulling out gigatons. And they actually do use the word gigatons. I found a couple programs, including Climeworks. In fact, maybe I can pull up a screen of Climeworks as well, to show people what technologies are available. Yeah.
That'd be great. While you're looking that up, so you were mentioning one of the questions I wanted to cover was a scandal relating to the IPCC. Is that what you were referring to with the big oil being involved?
Yes.
Okay.
People think that IPCC is strictly renewable energy, unbiased, neutral reporting, and unfortunately the scientists behind it have really co-opted the mission of IPCC, and being an international panel, unfortunately it allows the big oil to, as it says, big oil capture of IPCC assessment. That's the summary.
Yeah, I wonder if those sort of captures are occurring in other areas of science and technology. I feel like there's just, people have a general lack of faith in a lot of the institutions right now.
I'm sure it develops that kind of public response as a result, because we're not getting the reporting we used to get from Brinkley. What was that, Huntley-Brinkley report on Channel 4 when I grew up? That was the main source. They said, everyone would tune in to one station for news at 6 o'clock. And so we'd all get the same briefing, which actually was pretty balanced. Unfortunately, it's now changed to mostly social media for a good portion of the country, and that certainly changes the bias as a result.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, here's something. At least I found something similar. As I say, I have a bunch of articles that are published all over the world, and I've picked journals that are international, specifically to see if I can reach a larger audience. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to allow me to scroll downward to show the rest of it, But one of these has 13,000 views. And essentially you can see from the title that I'm looking for this century in terms of predictive quality. And what we end up finding is that the graph that Jim Hansen, who is a famous climatologist from NASA, actually published in 2006, has now been actually being fulfilled. And it took me literally 20 years to look at the impact and the verification of what Dr. Hansen did. So after about 10 years, in 2016, I started becoming more motivated because people were actually acknowledging the number of degrees that were possible by the end of the century. His graph predicts 6 degrees C by 2100. And it's not even 2100 that's the limit, it's the indebtedness for the 420 parts per billion that we have now. So it turns out to be 20 parts per billion equal 1 degree C. Anything above 290, we can just subtract. And I used to subtract from 410, giving me 120 parts per million, divide by 20, and you get 6. And that's how simple his graph allows this linear relationship to be analyzed. And I found this so shocking, I started sharing it with everyone, and there's nobody in the world, literally, that still is on board for Jim Hansen's discovery. So these publications allow me to at least let people know and say, well, you can look at it, you can see the facts, and here's what we need to do to bring 420 down to 290. But it's a Herculean task, and we have proofs that this is very correlated. The 420 is correlated to the amount of heat we're going to get, and we are getting.
I see.
Yeah. So, okay, so that's enough on climate because it's very depressing. It doesn't have a lot of hope because we don't have a good bunch of NGOs that are addressing the gigaton range, but there are a few. Right. And it's DAC or CDR, carbon dioxide removal or direct air capture. And Climeworks is one of the best.
On a positive note, I understand that your institute does work in the earthquake prediction sector. Could you go into a little bit of detail on that?
Sure. Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher was a colleague of mine, a good friend I knew for decades, and she was the first physicist to be hired at Berkeley University. And she was hired during the era when perhaps that was controversial, but it still is controversial to have women scientists on board. And so, anyways, she became an expert in zero-point energy. I knew a lot of expert areas that she published on, and one was specifically in earthquake prediction. And the way she discovered that was we were basically involved, myself, Dr. Becker, Robert Becker, who was famous for the bioelectric book, and also Elizabeth Rauscher, the three of us were designing for a contest the measurement of the Earth's magnetic field resonance, which is around 8 hertz per second. It's the same as your alpha rhythm. It's a Schumann resonance, which is very powerful. And so as we were doing this, she alerted me to the fact she had already published articles on the fact that that frequency and also other frequencies in that range of ULF or ELF, extremely low frequency, became more activated as tectonic plates started scratching against each other and moving, as they do just before the earthquake. That is a big jump. So those kind of stresses, in other words, in piezoelectric rock, cause electromagnetic fields. And so fast forward to, she got patents, she published, she's in my book, Harnessing the Wheelwork of Nature, which is my first Tesla book. I have 2 books on Nikola Tesla. And she contributed an excellent one where she even predicted, this is funny, on the site of the U.S. Geological Survey conference, she predicted there would be an earthquake within a month. And it happened, and she didn't get any credit for it. But she had already seen the signals and recorded the signals, and she says so in that article, which I published in that harnessing the wheelwork of nature. So if we fast forward to Quake Finder, which you can see, there's a whole bunch of articles that are wonderfully available on their website, quakefinder.com. The top one in 2022 is Case Control Study on a Decade of Ground-Based Magnetometers, which is what Elizabeth Rauscher used to use as well, in California, reveals a modest signal 24 to 72 hours prior to earthquakes. And that's exactly what the USGS is not doing for the public. Letting people know of 1 to 3 days in advance of an earthquake that could strike California. And California is susceptible all along the coast. If you look at the Cascadia area of the Seattle, that place is going to be devastated when the Cascadia rock, one's going underneath right on the Pacific coast, and the other's basically standing still. And as that rock moves underneath, the earthquake will just level Seattle. And I've been to Seattle, I've talked to nonprofits there, and unfortunately most of the buildings are not earthquake proof. They just, like Greece, they don't think about it until it happens. So San Francisco is another good example. And hopefully this technology, as we advocate it and publish and promote, will eventually supplant the seismometers that only give a few minutes of information as the earthquake is starting. That's the problem, the predicament we're in right now with earthquakes. Yeah.
I wasn't expecting to talk about this, but why do you think that there wouldn't be more incentive for organizations like the government to jump on this and utilize these technologies?
I've talked to the scientists at USGS because they've been at panels where I've been at the same panel, next to, around the corner from it. When I was on Capitol Hill recently for the EESI, Energy and Environment Studies Institute. And they have a conference on Capitol Hill every year. So USGS shows up as well as various others. And basically it's apathy, or we've always done this way. I even gave them our report. I gave them a copy of our report that has Elizabeth Rauscher in it and a few others. Quake Finder is the next one I'm going to add to the report. I probably need to publish a book and start sending copies around. We did that years ago when we had a funded research on an energy basically program for the government. That's back when the Bush administration and the Clinton administration actually published energy projections for the year. And it was great back then because they actually tried to analyze what could be done. And this is the same thing. Earthquakes could be predicted if we did X, Y, and Z, but is there any incentive? Is there any funding? Is there advocacy? I even work with some of the senators and congressmen, and they are basically, the feet are stuck in the mud. It's not only difficult to get the staffer excited, but I've got a whole bunch of other things that are higher priority. We'll add it to the list, and then a year later I realized, nothing's been done.
Right.
But that's the government for you.
Yeah, it's similar to the famous quote. I'll probably butcher it, but the fact that science advances one funeral at a time. So it takes a long time for these kinds of things to be recognized.
If science would get on board, that would help. Because if we had one Carl Sagan, for example, in the geological area, we could start using geothermal all over the country. And MIT already proved geothermal would be a great source of power, which is 24 hours, and the U.S. has plenty of sources for that. So, we need a great pioneering scientist.
Right. Well, if you're listening to this right now, maybe somebody can take up that call. I wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned a book that kind of revolves around the body and electricity, and I understand that probably plays into some of your work with bioelectromagnetic healing. Could you describe what is bioelectromagnetic healing, and how did you become aware of this? Because I think that for a lot of folks, I know for me, this has always seemed like something that didn't really have a lot of scientific backing to it, but having read through the information that you provided to me ahead of this interview, I realized that there's actually a substantial body of evidence indicating the validity of these techniques. So could you help me understand a little bit more about what that is and perhaps similarly, why is that not something that's more well known and well appreciated?
Sure, I can do that. In fact, if you wouldn't mind, I'll grab a copy of the book just
Certainly.
to show it. So everything I'm going to say is basically in the new version, the new edition. This is like the 12th edition of bioelectromagnetic healing. And it has a Likovsky machine on the cover, which we actually make and sell. I have an order from Australia right now for one of these. And so to answer your question, basically we're looking at, my wife and I just published another article this year in a journal, American Journal of Biomedical Science and Research, on the fact that electrotherapy can save healthcare. And that's our position, literally, because as we gather medical doctors as clients and customers, we realize this is a serious problem. Why would medical doctors who already supposedly have good medical training come to our nonprofit organization to get educated about electrotherapy, when 100 years ago they were learning it in medical school? However, it turns out, and Dr. Glenn Gordon is someone I'll refer to as we were talking. He's my mentor because we designed a product after him, and he educated me because he lived through the Flexner Report. And the Flexner Report is the big turning point in 1910 when the AMA and the FDA conspired to ban the use of electromagnetism. And I'm reading from our article, declared electromagnetism, quote, irregular science, unquote. And it was purged from the EM teaching was purged from medical curricula. So the Flexner Report was so influential, funded by the Carnegie Foundation, that medical schools literally became pharmaceutical schools. And unfortunately, we are now 100 years later still suffering from that narrow-minded view of medicine. Just to give you an example of the background that the human body requires, I was in a science bookstore downtown, and I picked up a biophysics book from Russia that specifically opened up the page, as I often do. What can this book tell me? Well, the sentence I read was, the body stores energy two ways, as electrical gradients and chemical gradients. And I said, bingo, a light went off in my head. I said, this answers all the questions I've had about what happened 100 years ago. Because now we're concentrated on chemical gradients, how to manipulate chemicals, and, what if they have side effects? Yeah, well, no problem. The sudden death and cardiac arrest and all those side effects.
Just take another pill.
On television, check with your doctor before you consume this pill, which may have all these deleterious effects. The energy gradients, the electrical gradients, are what we're talking about. You can get them from high voltage, you can get them from microcurrent, you can get them from pulsed magnetic fields. I mean, it's exciting to me to learn that they have no side effects and they're therapeutically effective within 20 minutes.
Right.
So there you go. There's the summary of the problem and the solution.
Right. You mentioned on the cover of the book, there's a device that plays into this. Are there any other particular devices that you're aware of that you think are pretty interesting that we may be seeing in the future?
Yes, actually, as a matter of fact, we do have what's called the EM pulsar, and it's probably easier for me to grab it than perhaps see our screen.
Show and tell is great. That'd be good.
Okay, so back to your question. Any other devices that we've developed besides the Likovsky high voltage device? This is called an EM pulsar, and basically it's heart-friendly, bio-friendly. It has attachments that can plug in not only the AC adapter, but also, I'm not sure if you can see this on the screen.
Yeah, I can. Mm-hmm.
You can
There's
see
a light
the
and
flickering,
a hole.
but the flickering probably isn't very apparent. It's 8 times per second.
Oh, okay. Probably
so
faster than the refresh rate of these screens.
I think so, yeah. But just give it a try anyways. So the important part about using this is that it has a coil which is actually labeled underneath the rubber boot. It says coil in the circle there. And basically you can put it where there's pain. As Dr. Gordon explains in the video, we supply a DVD with it. It's also online on our bioenergydevice.org website. The important part is that when you place it where there's trauma, and this is the interesting thing about this discovery of Dr. Gordon's, is that he found that NASA had already proved this, that when it's placed in an area where you just hit something and you know you're going to get a black and blue. My wife literally hit her forehead on a metal weight bench. She had just finished doing lifting weights, and so it was unprotected. Yeah. And she started getting a black and contusion, swelling. Right. And so she grabbed this, put it right on their forehead, and within 20 minutes it was gone. When I came home from work, there was no swelling, there was nothing there. It was a normal forehead. I couldn't believe her story. I mean, that's so remarkable. I also witnessed her falling off a metal chair. She hit her tibia, the shin, in other words, very painful, usually a black and blue mark. And so we grabbed one of these instead of an ice pack, because I literally thought of the ice pack at first. The same story within 20 minutes, half hour at the most. There was no swelling, no black and blue mark, and you could literally see a slight indent in her tibia where the impact of the edge of the metal chair had hit. And the funny thing is, she had a black and blue mark on the other knee, which she never treated because it wasn't as
control
painful.
Group.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole thing was like a blessing in disguise. And we supply a little pad, which is a pancake coil inside here, spiral coil, in other words, very flat. And so you can wrap it around your knee, for example. NASA's discovered that there are not only cardioprotection effects from this type of 7.8 hertz pulse rate, but there's also cartilage regeneration. So for senior citizens that keep coming to us for bad knees, bad lower back, bad hips, this is the type of technology that NASA's shown will help regenerate cartilage, because it simulates the weight-bearing exercise that normally would be needed to get bone and cartilage to be regenerated. People as they get older are not lifting weights, and unless you're doing weight-bearing exercise, bones don't get stretched and let calcium in, and the joints are the same thing. Joints have no blood circulation, and unless you move and do exercise with weights, the joints are going to suffer. And that's the common problem as people get older. Yeah.
I see. My sister actually, she had a broken foot, and she had some sort of an osteopad, which was intended to help regrow bone. It sounds like it might be somewhat of a similar concept.
Well, if it's that name, that's our product. Yeah, osteopad.org is the website.
Oh, well, yeah, exactly. I think this is probably something that people are going to be really fascinated by and want to learn more about. You mentioned that you have a 12th edition of your book on this. Mm-hmm. Are there any other resources that you would direct people to in order for them to learn more about this on their own?
Our websites tend to be the most educational source. Mm-hmm. Bioenergydevice.org is a comprehensive web page that includes all the products. EM Pulsar, Osteopad, MaxiMat. We even have a mini mat, for example. And the last three are all devoted to the cartilage regeneration and bone strength increasing. And then the EM Pulsar has attachments that are available, and that's explained on bioenergydevice.org. But our book, Bioelectromagnetic Healing, which I was showing, is really not only the history, but also the science of not only high voltage therapy, but also pulsed EMF. It has various chapters on each topic. And I try to explain it in very succinct ways, and also pretty good appendix on references too. About 100 references available on Amazon.
Yeah. That was the first one that I opened up when you sent your books over to me, because I was like, this is really compelling stuff. I got to take a look at this. And yeah, you do a good job of sort of citing and having, direct references to previous works by various scientists.
Thanks.
I wanted to make sure to save some time to talk to you about 0 Point Energy. That's ultimately the first place where I discovered your work. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people hear about zero point energy in the lexicon nowadays, especially in the UFO community and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But what I didn't realize until just earlier, late last year, was the body of scientific evidence extending all the way back to Tesla and Thomas Townsend Brown, of
Right.
people actually working on this. And so, how did you discover the concepts of zero point energy, and what was it for you that first kind of made you want to dig into that? I know for me it was Thomas Townsend Brown, and maybe for you it was the same, but I'm curious about your origins with that.
Oh, well, Nikola Tesla really deserves some credit, and I'll grab a copy of my previous edition of the book, which is more accessible than the newest edition. This is my original copy of the book, and I also have another one that's my thesis on zero point energy. But I designed this book to really have lots of pictures, pictures on almost every page. It's available in color as well, and it's designed to explain zero point energy to the layperson. And what I started with originally, I have to give Maury King a little credit too, because Maury King used to come to various conferences like the Tesla conference and U.S. Psychotronics Association conferences, and essentially talk about quantum mechanics and how there's a big quantum field of zero point energy that we should be tapping. Tapping the zero point energy is, I think, the title of one of his books. So Maury King is a very dynamic person, presents a lot of information that I really needed to research. So as a physicist, I was very curious about it, and I still needed a good topic for my thesis. And then when I got fired from the patent office in '99, I found myself just like Robert Becker. Literally, when he got fired from his hospital, he wrote The Body Electric, which was the best thing that could have happened for his career. And I think the same thing is true for me. I was able to finish my PhD, choosing zero point energy as my thesis topic, and doing all the research necessary within the 6 years I was out of the office to do a good job on the thesis and get my PhD finalized. So the thesis is in the practical conversion of zero point energy book, which is literally an 8.5 by 11 paperback, and that sells very slowly because it's all theoretical. And then the zero point energy fuel of the future is a more popular version of that. And as I researched the topic, I became more and more excited about the practicality of conversion. I even designed what's called a zero bias diode type of arrangement that could literally use the fluctuations, that quantum fluctuations that are available at 0 degrees, which is fascinating to me. Cooling anything down to within microdegrees of zero, absolute zero Kelvin, still involves energy. In other words, the liquid helium stays liquid even at 0 degrees, and there's quantum fluctuations, which Dr. Sabato from the University of Arkansas actually has capitalized on. It took him 10 years. I've been in touch with him every so often to keep track of how he's progressing. And he found that graphene, one single layer, atomic layer of graphene oscillates at room temperature.
Oh, interesting.
Continually. It's free energy. We finally have free energy. I've been a proponent.
Perpetual
one of the
graphene.
Few, and graphene literally is the. And what was interesting, it took him years to do it. He designed a circuit, which is explained on his website, of how that can be converted to electricity. So he's already getting small milliamps or less of energy from a single graphene oscillation, and he's designed a solid-state device to do that. Dr. Modell from Colorado State is another example of using zero-point energy. So this is an exciting field. It's not only how I got started, but also how the progression has taken place.
You mentioned a couple names there, Modell, and also I'm forgetting the gentleman with the graphene. Would you be able to maybe, Sabato, okay. What are the other notable scientists, inventors in this space, people like Henry Casimir, who have really played crucial roles in this study? I think for a lot of folks, and I'll just speak for myself, being able to kind of look at a list of individuals who have produced work in this space and people who have a credible history would be really valuable for those of us who just don't necessarily, this is a new concept for a lot of people. I think scientists talk now about the virtual particles, and it seems to me like just a new name for the ether. But I was hoping you could just lend a little bit of credibility to what you're saying by providing some particular scientists or inventors who you're kind of drawing this information from.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's really what my first chapter is all about. Just to show you a sample page here. Not only is the Casimir effect being shown there, but Dr. Hal Puthoff is right next to it.
Yes.
And Hal Puthoff's published extensively, as Dr. Modell has done, the Lamb shift, for example. My first chapter, literally, I focus on all the famous people that are responsible for the history and development of zero-point energy. In fact, here's a picture of Pinto. Dr. Pinto was a keynote speaker at one of our conferences, which we've had 12 conferences on future energy, COFI 1 through 12, which is also available. If I shared the screen, that would be another possible example. The interesting thing is that the COFI experience has been really a good way to bring the best conferences or the best speakers. Oh, I'm lucky. I actually got it right away. I was able to get the best speakers as keynote speakers, as presenters. We had literally a dozen presenters for every single conference, mostly in the Washington, D.C. area, also in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which the Tesla conference, teslatech.info, is still going on this August. I give a little blurb promo for Steve Ellswick, because he was a great host for our conference for at least 4 years. We used to travel out to Albuquerque and present with a dozen other scientists on various energy, propulsion, or bioenergetics. So, and then here's what you're looking at here on the shared screen is our last conference, which is called COFI 12. At the very top, you see that it's also available on flash drive. The website I'm looking at is literally futureenergy.org, and Future Energy is with one E in the center. So all one word, futureenergy.org. And what's interesting about COFI 12 is we did it virtually. Oh, there's the website right here. I'm sorry. Futureenergy.org. So what's exciting about this particular conference is during COVID, Steve decided to cancel Tesla Tech, Extraordinary Technology Conference. And we were part of that. So I said, I'm not going to cancel it because I got all the scientists lined up already. So we did it virtually on Zoom on 2 days. And it's an exciting one. It's available on DVD. You can order the DVD in MP4s, or you can look at the key, which is what I produced later on, which includes all 12 conferences and the most important highlights of COFI 12 as well. But back to why I'm even mentioning all of this is Dr. Pinto. Well, Dr. Pinto was as I say, a keynote speaker for one of the conferences that we had. And what was interesting about his presentation, besides all the great examples of ZPE that he knew about, was he said, here's an example of the Casimir force, which normally the Casimir force is two parallel plates attracted because the number of frequencies in between them, virtual frequencies, are less than the ones outside the two plates. And that's the picture you see even on the cover of the book, the old version. Well, he says the macroscopic version in a real world is when two boats get close to each other. The same thing occurs in water waves.
Right.
There's more force on the outside. The boats literally will always hit each other. And it's a hazard. In other words, they have to know within a certain distance that, oh, this is serious, put on the motors, get farther apart. Because the Casimir force is literally the same analogous situation with water waves. So he was great in terms of how many practical examples of the utilization of zero-point energy was available, and also some of the insights about how to use it. He has a great patent, for example, that has a Casimir cavity that has a movable section that's activated by tiny micro lasers. And I found all of the parts that could make this possible, and it's basically another free energy generator. So
Right.
these inventors are amazing. I was so happy to bring them all together, and now we have the key that's available for only $45. We're discounting that, 16 gigabytes worth of information. All the proceedings, some of the proceedings are 700 pages, but they all fit on the key drive very well. I should have sent a sample of it to you. I'm happy to do that if you're interested.
Yeah, that's a lot of conferences. Is that you alluded to at the beginning your removal as a patent examiner, and I believe that your first conference played a role in that process.
Yep.
And we kind of started to talk about this before the recording, but maybe we could kind of continue that story.
Sure. It's a kind of a badge of courage. I literally told my supervisors this as well, because I became a black sheep as a result of that. Being fired and rehired is not good in the government. You always have a black mark on your soul, so to speak. even if my record was purged and I have a certificate congratulating me for 20 years of service, even though 6 years of it was at home, and where I never worked for the patent office for 6 years and got my PhD instead. Okay, so 99, as I might have mentioned to you, we, with the original board of directors, we sort of thought, well, hey, one of you is working in the State Department. The U.S. State Department's pretty influential. Why don't we do something for the Secretary's Open Forum? Well, the interesting thing is the woman who worked there, she basically alluded to the fact, well, the Secretary's Open Forum was designed during the Vietnam era to allow for contradictory voices to be heard that might oppose or be different than the government's point of view. And I thought that was wonderful, because Conference on Free Energy, which is what we originally called it, and then quickly changed it to Conference on Future Energy when the bad press started to appear, became an interesting forum. And we thought, well, we've designed it with all the speakers, let's try the very first one before the end of the century, 99. And as a result, it attracted the only physicist, Dr. Zimmerman, from the State Department, who decided, oh, we're going to introduce and enforce a peer review process. And he, unfortunately, I didn't explain, 25 years ago, literally, cold fusion was a no-no. Cold fusion was the pseudoscience example for any mainstream scientist. They loved just kicking that around and bad-mouthing it and denigrating it to the point of laughter, creating laughter in the audience. And Zimmerman was famous for that. In fact, some of the recorded presentations were, oh, I finally kicked it out of the State Department because it was a cold fusion conference. Well, we literally had only one cold fusion speaker from Los Alamos Labs, very reputable scientist who I literally got 20 years later to talk about the updates on cold fusion. And essentially it was to the point where it embarrassed the patent office management, and I became a pariah at the office for even trying to have something happen in the government. Or, yeah, it was in the State Department government. DOE was ready to have me host me as well. I mean, this was fun to do in the beginning, and then a real burden when I literally was forced out of the State Department, and I investigated, oh, why don't you go to the Commerce Department? That's where you work. Okay, I'll try. I did. I made one visit to the Commerce Department people asking about the use of their auditorium, and that became the source of my, what they called investigation. And essentially I was fired for misrepresentation and conflict of interest, which became almost a ludicrous reason for removal, because no one else had been fired for those very inconsequential reasons. And it took 6 years for the union, the Patent Office Examiners Union, to prove that through Freedom of Information Act. And all the emails that we found were just incriminating for the management. It was funny too to be sitting there in the various arbitration. By the way, there's an 85-page report from the arbitrator on the website, futureenergy.org. You scroll all the way down to the bottom for Kofi 1, and you can read what the arbitrator wrote about my situation. And it's a great biography in a way, because he describes all the bad publicity that I got for no good reason. But
Right.
but just to give you an example, I was sitting in the arbitration hearing, one of many, and finally I get the commissioner of the patent office as a witness, as a, being interviewed by the union reps. And one of the questions from the arbitrator was, have you ever worked as in the patent office as an examiner? And he said, oh yes, years ago. Mr. Godici was his name. And he said, well, what topic did you examine? Mousetraps. And did you find a better mousetrap? Yes. And I was starting to giggle and laugh. I couldn't believe that a person of this qualification and stature would have started with the least scientific invention in the world, a mousetrap. It was just, that shows you how the Peter Principle is constantly operating in various hierarchies. So eventually the arbitrator came to a decision. It forced the patent office to give me back pay, which is a real problem because you lose most of it in tax revenues. But anyways, that's how my nonprofit really got a boost, buying a copy machine and various other things. And essentially then I was able to put in another 10 years, literally, of work at the patent office. And then essentially was able to get a good retirement, which allows me now to volunteer for my nonprofit organization. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you for telling us about that history.
Sure.
That makes I think it helps me understand sort of where you've come from and why you perhaps have such passion for these types of things. For my last question, I just wanted to sort of on a more grand scale ask, you mentioned 0-point energy and things like cold fusion. And I think that it's potentially those things may have relationships to one another, but just in general, do you think that factions of humanity have been able to operationalize cold fusion or 0-point energy devices? And is that something that's been done in black projects, or potentially even something that's maybe even live in the commercial sector, but it's just not marketed in that manner? What could you say about that?
Well, I actually have an entirely different presentation on ufology, and I know Bob Lazar, for example, personally, and Linda Moulton Howe. I can go down the list of great ufologists that have really been a great help to educating myself in terms of answering your question. And literally, I guess we could maybe, I did this before, and that was the ARV, the image.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if I can still pull that up because it may have been changed or moved or not as accessible as before.
I've got a lot of those on my computer. I can always
good for you. Okay.
Share one.
So
Yeah.
to answer your question, yes, it has been suppressed. I learned this even when I worked at the patent office. The patent office literally has across the street from where I worked, there's several buildings, 5 of them for the patent office. And I was prohibited from visiting, which I used to do all the time, the energy and security area of the patent office that has a vault. And the vault basically is just a guarded room that's locked, and it turns out there's at least 4,000 patents that are secretized. That's the word.
The
that
Invention Secrecy Act.
Right. However, that doesn't cover the reason that they're secretized, because the Invention Secrecy Act really addresses atomic energy and various other things that are dangerous. But energy and propulsion normally are not dangerous, except if they're very powerful. And that becomes the gray area where these get reviewed. And I used to get a sheet of paper, which I still have copies of, that had every single military agency with a little box next to their acronym signing off on a particular application of whether or not it should be secretized. And I would only get it if they said no. And if they said yes, it would go across the street and never be seen again. And it would literally be 50 years before it would be declassified or desecretized, and most often the inventor passes away by then. Well, people can visit the Federation of American Scientists. It's FAS.org. And FAS.org does have a list of these yearly increases in secretized patents. But to really generalize to what's happening at Area 51 and S4, it really scratches the surface. Because everything you might find in that vault really don't relate to how serious the back engineering has progressed, to the point where I believe, and I think the evidence now from McKinnon, McKinnon is a UK guy that the NASA
Gary
tried.
McKinnon, the hacker.
Yeah, this hacker is incredible. What a great service he did for mankind to find on the NASA website the list of different back-engineered craft that have these majestic names to them. Linda Moulton Howe was excited too. She's got a whole video on this topic. But the fact is, it's progressed so much farther than we possibly imagined. And the story that McKinnon gives us, as well as Linda, is that these craft are already being used to visit other planets. So the back engineering is so, I would say, unbelievable. That's the best word for it. That people now are being handed little portions on various ancient alien shows and extraordinary science. There's a few different ones on the History Channel that give you just samples. But really to kind of bring this home to more practical means, I would at least like to mention that there are practical versions of energy that we should be considering for clean energy. And we've reported on them in various slideshows and presentations, even on our website. And people may not be aware of the fact that as we're looking at even evaporation or geothermal or offshore wind, these things are very powerful in terms of our transition from fossil fuels to clean energy that don't use up the environmental and produce CO2. Well, unfortunately, what we find with, for example, offshore wind is that Florida, DeSantis, has outlawed offshore wind for no good reason except that the fossil fuel industry would suffer. And we see the same thing with meat. I don't know if anyone gets the magazine called The Week, but this cover story is literally about laboratory meat. And anyone who studied the use of land, I mean, our population has literally tripled since I was born. We had 2 billion people in the world around 1950. Now we're at 8 billion or so. And we're literally approaching 11 billion by, who knows, around 2100 before it levels off. So the use of land is very important to feed the world. And there's lots of stories I can tell about feeding the world and how the Green Revolution was great to give us a boost, but it just boosted population growth. So the important thing is that using land efficiently for like vertical farming is amazing. It's so efficient. 90% of the land is literally you're saving, and it's no pesticides. You just use no soil is needed. But the important part is that we have a chance to really also start using laboratory meat for the carnivores that still eat meat. I don't eat meat, but other people do. And this is a serious problem over the world because meat eating is an affluent diet. We used to teach environmental science, and that becomes the luxury of societies that get to the point where they can afford it. Well, we can't afford it in terms of the land use and the water use anymore, and that's where laboratory meat would be useful. But we're finding the red states literally are outlawing the use of laboratory meat. So there's a lot of backlash to issues, but one of the good news is, and I can finish my spiel on energy with Redwood Materials. Redwoodmaterials.com may be an unknown company to most people. However, it was formed from the CEO and the COO of Tesla. Tesla Motor, two management people decided to form this company, and guess what? They now recycle 90% of lithium-ion batteries. And this is tremendous because they're feeding the Tesla company and others with recycled lithium, instead of trying to find sources overseas, which has been a problem ever since.
Yeah, that's a area fraught with issues.
Mm-hmm.
Redwoodmaterials.com. Okay, I've got that written down. Go ahead and add that in the description.
It's a super
I wanted to close
exciting
this
company.
out with a call to action. So you just mentioned that it seems like people or factions of humanity have developed these hyper advanced technologies potentially beyond the belief of many everyday citizens.
Right.
What can somebody listening to this video do to propel those technologies from the black world into the commercial sector? Is there anything that we can do to instigate that process?
Yes, actually there are more and more congressmen and senators that are becoming aware of the reality of UAPs. And UAPs is the most acceptable phrase to at least start the conversation with. And we have to start a kindergarten with these people, because literally you're dealing with the whole government that has been in denial for over 50 years. Now it's 70 years. 1947 is my transition year, where I still find lots of evidence that Roswell is real. However, what we're dealing with now in 2024 is the fact that some Congress people, in fact, we've had congressional hearings on it, acknowledge UAPs are real. Well, there's plenty of videos in my COPE 12 presentation on ufology that show Air Force pilots trying to chase after them, and they go fast and they change directions and they're on radar and so forth. So now we're at the point where, okay, this technology is so much more advanced. Is it possible it's from our black world, or is it from elsewhere? And that's the question that starts to get people nervous. So at least confronting congressional people, writing to your congressman, and at least supporting research into UAPs and UFOs, if you want to use that in parentheses, that would be a good start for the normal citizen. And then eventually the technological benefits could be addressed further down the line.
So yeah, it's just a matter of getting all of the litany of things that our Congress people have to look into, getting these kinds of topics to the top of mind. And right now they're potentially not for many of them.
Right. I mean, a good book is The Day After Roswell, where
I got that one.
the explanation of what happened to the distributed information that was gained and gleaned from all the wreckage was fascinating to me, because I even researched the dates when infrared viewing was available, or light source, light, I'm trying to think of the word for
Fiber optic cable?
Thank you. Fiber optics was developed. If you look at those invention dates and the dates that he suggests in his book, within 1 year. So the book is very credible as far as how some of these things were infiltrated into the industrial region.
Yeah, that's definitely a great starting point for anybody that's new to this.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the ones for me as well. Well, I really want to thank you again for joining me. And would you potentially just kind of, you've mentioned your website, but are there any other places for people to contact you directly, or is the website the best place? And other than that, I just want to close it out and once again, thank you for your time.
Sure. The main website, the home page, in other words, is at integrity-research.org. Or we can offer the older website, integrityresearchinstitute.org. So, and from there you can see a link to the new website. But integrity-research.org is the latest website, and that has at the bottom a way to send a website email to us directly. So that's and also I encourage people, we publish every month a Future Energy e-news. It's archived on the website as well, and you'll see that available on both websites as a link to our archive. IntegrityResearchInstitute.org has all of the 20 years worth of these, but you can join it for free, and it's emailed to thousands of people every month. And I literally have 5 stories that are most progressively developed discoveries every month. So Future Energy e-news, sign up for free, and we use constant contact for the distribution, so it's very professionally mastered as it's emailed.
Cool.
out.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Valone, for joining me today. This has been a real pleasure. You're somebody that I was shocked that I was able to talk to. So it's been a real experience.
I'm glad.
I'm super
And
grateful.
I'll send you a copy of the key as well, so for your enjoyment.
Yes, that would be amazing.
Token of appreciation.
I've got a lot to look into. Oh, hey, you're still here? Well, thanks for watching this far. I really appreciate you doing so. Maybe consider subscribing to the show. Also, leave me a comment in the description below with what you found most interesting about this video, or just make fun of me. That's great too. Either way, if you have a guest that you think would be good for the show, there's a contact in the description of this video. I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.